I remember the house before it broke, though it feels like it belonged to someone else, a stranger whose laughter was loud but brittle, whose walls were lined with echoes of arguments that never reached closure. Mom had a way of smiling through tension, but her eyes told another story, a story of exhaustion and barely concealed frustration. Dad, on the other hand, carried himself like a storm waiting to break, his voice booming over the smallest mistakes, over the tiniest annoyances. And in the middle of it all, I existed like a shadow, watching, absorbing, wishing that someone, anyone, would notice me. My sister was Mom's favorite from the start. Bright, outgoing, and clever, she drew Mom's attention like a moth to a flame. Mom would laugh at her jokes, buy her the prettiest dresses, and carry her into every conversation, as though she were the only child in the world. I tried to compete, tried to earn a fraction of that warmth, but my efforts always seemed to fall short. My brother, on the other hand, was Dad's pride and joy. Strong, determined, stubborn even, he inherited Dad's temper and his sharp tongue. They would spar like two halves of the same storm, and I would watch from the sidelines, afraid to step in, afraid to be wrong, afraid to exist at all. The fighting started small. A slammed door, a sharp word, but it grew until the house itself seemed to tremble. Every shouted accusation and whispered betrayal was a brick in the walls that would eventually divide us. I remember the nights when Mom and Dad would sit on opposite ends of the living room, arms crossed, eyes full of disdain, speaking only in thinly veiled barbs. And I would lie in my room, pretending to sleep, feeling the weight of their anger pressing down, suffocating me. The day it all ended, the day the fracture became a chasm, was quiet, almost painfully so. Mom came into my room first, her face strained but resolute. She took my sister's hand and whispered something I didn't fully understand, something about needing to protect her and start fresh. My sister waved at me, smiling nervously, and followed Mom out the door. I wanted to run after them to scream, to beg, but my legs wouldn't move. Then Dad came, and my brother slipped his hand into Dad's without hesitation. There was no room for me. No one even looked at me. I felt invisible as I watched them disappear down the driveway, the echo of their departure ringing in my ears. I wanted to hate them, wanted to curse the world, but instead I felt a hollow ache, a loneliness so deep that it seemed to swallow me whole. When I was finally taken to state care, I didn't cry. Not at first. Crying seemed pointless. I had no one to cry for and no one to hold me. The foster workers were kind enough, polite, but they were strangers, and strangers could never fill the emptiness left by my family's abandonment. I learned quickly that in this new world, my voice didn't matter. My wishes, my fears, my heartbreak. They were irrelevant. I was just another child in a system too big to care. And yet, even then, in the shadow of my loss, a tiny ember of defiance sparked inside me. I would survive. I would not disappear the way they had made me feel. One day, I promised myself, I would be the one saying no. State care was nothing like home, though I don't think I had a home anymore. The walls here were sterile, painted in colors that were supposed to soothe, but only reminded me of how cold life could be. I was assigned a room with a bed that sagged in the middle, and a thin blanket that did little to keep out the chill. The first night, I curled into myself, hugging my knees, listening to the faint hum of fluorescent lights, and imagined my sister's laughter and my brother's mischievous grin. They felt so far away, as though they belonged to a world I could never reach again. Days blurred into weeks, and the routine of state care became a strange kind of cage. I learned the rules quickly. Don't make waves. Don't ask too many questions. Don't expect anyone to notice when you're hurting. Every foster home I was placed in seemed temporary, a revolving door of people who didn't know my name, didn't care about my fears, and certainly wouldn't remember my birthday. At first, I tried to talk, tried to make a connection, but every smile was met with guarded politeness, and every attempt at friendship was met with distance. I realized quickly that attachment here was dangerous. It hurt too much when people left, and yet, memories of my siblings haunted me. I would lie awake at night, imagining my sister tucked into bed by Mom, feeling safe and loved, while my brother clumsily tried to mimic Dad's stoic strength. Anger bubbled up in me, not at them, but at the parents who had carved us apart, leaving me behind. I wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice, but the walls around me seemed to swallow my voice whole. I began to understand the bitter truth of my situation. I was invisible, powerless, expendable, but somewhere in the pit of despair, a spark ignited. If no one else would fight for me, I had to fight for myself. I began to notice the small ways I could reclaim control. I started reading voraciously, letting the characters in books become my secret allies. I learned how to navigate the bureaucracy, how to make my voice heard in the rare moments it mattered. Every tiny victory became a shield against the crushing loneliness. Even in this bleak world, I discovered resilience. There were rare moments of warmth, an encouraging teacher, a foster sibling who shared their snacks, a caseworker who smiled and listened. These small connections reminded me that kindness existed, even if fleeting. I clung to them, storing them away like precious treasure. They taught me that power wasn't always about revenge or anger. Sometimes it was about surviving, enduring, and learning to protect yourself. I promised myself I would never feel that helpless again. I would never allow anyone to determine my worth or dictate my life. I was done being invisible, and though I was still a child, still trapped in the system, a quiet determination settled in me. One day I told myself the tables would turn. One day I would be the one with the voice, the power, the choice. One day I would say no, and this time everyone would have to listen. The first time I let that thought fully blossom, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, terrified but alive, ready to leap into a life I could finally claim as my own. Life in state care wasn't easy, but eventually, I learned that survival required more than just enduring. It required strategy, awareness, and sometimes defiance. After months of feeling invisible, I began noticing patterns, reading people like open books. I learned which foster homes were bearable, which teachers could be trusted, and which walls I could lean on without falling through. Each small discovery was a step toward reclaiming a life I had almost lost to despair. The turning point came unexpectedly. I met Mrs. Callahan, a volunteer at the state center, whose patience was both fierce and gentle. She asked questions I wasn't used to hearing, questions that didn't come with judgment or obligation. "What do you want?" she would ask, tilting her head with a smile that suggested she actually wanted to hear the answer. At first I shrugged, hiding behind the armor I had spent years forging. But slowly, I started to speak, little by little, about dreams I barely allowed myself to imagine. She didn't try to fix me, didn't tell me how to feel. She simply reminded me that I had a voice, and that my voice mattered. Around the same time, I met Ethan, a foster sibling just a year older than me, who had been through his own storm. We didn't need to explain our histories. Our silence spoke volumes. We shared small victories and small defeats, laughed when things seemed unbearably grim, and sometimes just sat together in quiet solidarity. Through him, I began to understand the power of connection, not the suffocating kind that demanded perfection, but the kind that allowed us to grow stronger by leaning on each other. As I learned to trust, I also learned to defend my boundaries. I realized that the anger I carried for my parents wasn't wrong, but it was dangerous if left unchecked. It could consume me, prevent me from becoming more than a ghost of my own potential. I practiced saying no, not in rage, not in retaliation, but with quiet firmness. No to manipulation, no to cruelty, no to anyone trying to dictate my worth. Each refusal was a small act of power, a reminder that I could survive without surrendering my spirit. Books became my refuge and my mentor. I devoured stories of women and men who had been discarded, underestimated, or abandoned, yet found their strength and reshaped their lives. I studied their strategies, their patience, their courage. Every lesson became a blueprint, a map to navigate the treacherous path of my own life. Slowly, I built an invisible armor around me, not to shut out the world, but to enter it on my own terms. By the time I turned 16, I had transformed. I wasn't the scared, overlooked child who had been left behind. I was someone who could stand, who could fight, who could choose. I started planning for the day I would leave state care, not with fear, but with purpose. I imagined a future where my parents' betrayals didn't define me, where my siblings' paths didn't dictate mine, and where my voice could finally rise without hesitation. And in the quiet moments when no one was looking, I whispered to myself the promise that had taken root months ago. One day, I will be the one saying no. And this time, no one will ever make me feel powerless again. The first time I stood face with my mother as an adult, I realized that fear no longer had a hold on me. She looked at me as if searching for the frightened child I once was, but all she found was someone who had survived, someone who had grown stronger in the shadows she had left me in. My heart ached at the memories, my sister clinging to Mom's side, my brother grinning beside Dad, but the ache no longer dictated my actions. This time I would choose. Mom started with the usual pleas, the familiar attempt to guilt me into compliance. "I just want us to be a family again," she said, her voice trembling. I listened, silently measuring the words, weighing them against years of absence and neglect. I had learned that love without respect is no gift, it's a cage, and I had spent too long in cages. "No," I said calmly, firmly. The word tasted strange at first, heavy and yet freeing. My mother flinched, and I realized how powerful it was to assert myself not in anger, not in spite, but with conviction. I wasn't rejecting her as a person. I was rejecting the role she had forced me into, the overlooked, powerless child who could be bargained for, manipulated, or forgotten. When I saw my sister that day, I felt a flicker of the old longing, but she had been shaped by their influence, and I recognized that forcing connection would only recreate the past. I offered her a gentle smile instead, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond we might have shared, but refused to step into the roles that had been predetermined for us. "I love you," I whispered truthfully, "but I can't be the sister you need right now." And in that moment, I realized that love, too, could be an act of strength rather than surrender. Later, I faced my father. His pride had always been a fortress, but this time I approached it with clarity. He attempted the old tactics: condescension, criticism, the subtle assertion that I owed him gratitude for surviving. I shook my head, steady and unwavering. "No," I said again, "I am not your reflection, your legacy, or your tool. I am myself, and I will no longer be silenced or controlled." The words resonated in the quiet room like a bell tolling freedom. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't in years: balance. The past, with its betrayals and heartbreaks, could not touch me unless I allowed it. The weight of abandonment had been heavy, but I had lifted it myself through perseverance, patience, and the quiet power of self-respect. Revenge wasn't in breaking them. It was in reclaiming my life, my choices, and my voice. Walking away from both of them, I felt a lightness that astonished me. I didn't need apologies, reconciliations, or validation. I had earned something far more enduring: autonomy. I realized that saying no was not merely refusal, it was affirmation. It was telling the world and myself that my story was mine to write, unshackled by the failures of those who had once abandoned me. As I stepped into my own life, I carried no hatred, only clarity. The ache of loss remained, but it had transformed into resolve. I was no longer the child left behind. I was the architect of my future, the keeper of my boundaries, and the one finally in charge. And with every step forward, I whispered the promise that had begun in a lonely room years ago: "No, I decide, I choose, I am enough."